When you look at Michael Douglas, you see a guy who usually looks tough as rock. He's basically what tough Hollywood stars are all about. A person who beat cancer, who got through one of the most public family crises you can think of, and who has kept a career going for more than half a century. But the Michael Douglas who came forward yesterday wasn't the one everyone knows. He wasn't the smooth actor or the respected family leader in movies. He was a heartbroken friend, and what he said about Rob Reiner's death wasn't just a nice tribute or an emotional goodbye. It was a big reveal that totally shook everyone who thought they understood this sad story. Because most people just see the headlines, Rob Reiner dead, son arrested, and they think they have the full picture, a story that fits a pattern that's way too common. The troubled son, the sad ending. But Douglas says we need to stop and really listen to what he's saying. Because in this whole industry, he's the only one with the real authority and personal experience to talk about the specific hell that Rob Reiner was going through before he died. Michael Douglas didn't just work with Rob Reiner. They were cut from the same cloth. Both were sons of legends. Kirk Douglas and Carl Reiner both had to fight their whole lives to make their own names under the shadow of giants. And in the most upsetting way possible, both faced destroying battles with their own sons over addiction, fights that would have broken much tougher families. And when Michael decided to break the silence, he didn't do it through a publicist or post a clean message on social media. He spoke straight up, and his first words froze everyone, because he admitted he had warned him that 10 years ago he looked Rob in the eyes and told him that unconditional love was going to end up killing him. A line that's almost too hard to handle, since we've all been taught that love fixes everything, especially in a family. But Douglas pulled back the curtain on the real stuff happening inside the Brentwood house, a truth no one wanted to talk about, and admitted that over the last 5 years, he had slowly pulled away from the Reiner home. Not because he didn't care about Rob, but because he couldn't stand watching that slow and unavoidable crash happening with Nick right in front of everyone. To get what Michael Douglas was saying, you have to understand the full background, because he knows exactly what it looks like when a son goes off track. The whole world knows his own fight with his son Cameron. The trials, the prison visits, the public shame, and those endless nights when he was scared of getting a call that would change everything. But unlike Rob, Michael made painful choices, set hard and brutal boundaries that broke his heart, but that ended up saving his life, and over time helped save his son too. That's why he sees Rob's death not just as a violent act, but as a failure to step in. And he remembered a visit to the set of And So It Goes in 2014, when everything seemed calm on the surface. A time when he went to see his friend and ran into Nick, describing a look in his eyes that wasn't just anger or being high on something, but a scary emptiness, a total absence. And he said that when Nick showed up on set, the whole vibe of the place changed completely. Rob, the boss of the ship, the director everyone respected, shrank down. And the most heartbreaking part was seeing a man who could direct Jack Nicholson shake physically in front of his own son. Michael Douglas explained that back then it wasn't fear of physical violence, but something deeper and worse. Fear of letting down. The fear of a dad walking on eggshells in his own home. And he said that same day he pulled Rob aside in the trailer and asked him a question that still echoes. How long has he been the one in charge of the house? And Rob didn't know what to say, looked down and just said Nick was going through a tough time and they needed to help him get through it. And that's when Michael realized his friend was stuck in a toxic cycle of hope, a constant dream that things would get better on their own. And the reveals Douglas made about the final weeks before the tragedy are the ones that really hit hard, because everyone thought it was a sudden outburst, a crazy night moment. But he said, no, it wasn't. It was a slow buildup that everyone ignored. And he revealed that 3 weeks before, Rob had called him one Tuesday night, a missed call that Michael didn't see until the next morning. And when he called back, Rob sounded upbeat, talked about a new script. But now Michael is sure that call was a quiet cry for help. Michael Douglas explained that now he believes at that moment, Rob was about to do something he had never done before. Kick Nick out of the house for good and break the cycle that was destroying him. And Douglas is sure that Nick sensed that change. Because according to him, the real tragedy isn't that Nick suddenly lost control, but that he realized his parents were finally about to draw a line after decades of abuse. And that reality leads to the most uncomfortable part that Douglas forced everyone to face: the money. A topic no one wants to touch when talking about grief, but in Hollywood, it's the fuel for these fires. And he went straight at it by saying Rob wasn't just supporting a lifestyle, he was funding his own destruction, revealing that Nick had access to accounts and money that someone just over 30 should never handle without any checks. And it wasn't about spoiling him, but a never-ending rescue, because Nick used his own well-being as bargaining, threatening to hurt himself, disappear, or leak stories if the money stopped, turning his parents' love into a kind of blackmail that bought them one more day of fake peace without realizing they were paying for the weapon that would turn against them. What kept so many people glued, listening to Michael Douglas, was his anger aimed at the people who enabled that situation for years. Because even though he didn't name names, he made it clear that around the Reiners there were folks who made Nick's behavior seem normal, excusing it with lines like, "That's just him," or "He's a moody artist." And Douglas called that attitude a deadly kindness, remembering a dinner where Nick threw a glass across the room over something he took wrong. And instead of calling the cops or kicking him out, the guests looked down at their plates while the staff cleaned up the mess. Rob cracked a joke to ease the tension, and Michelle apologized for him. And that's when Douglas said something crushing, that everyone who stayed seated at that table without standing up to say that wasn't okay shared moral blame for what happened, because the group silence let the violence grow until it couldn't be stopped. It's really rare to see Michael Douglas cry, because he's always kept a strong and controlled front. But when he talked about Michelle, that wall finally cracked. He described her as the family shock absorber, because if Rob was the soft heart, then Michelle was the one trying to hold together the structure that was falling apart. And Douglas firmly believed she became the main target exactly because she had started saying no. He remembered a talk months ago where Michelle sounded worn out and told him with a simple but scary line that she no longer knew who her own son was. A statement that marks the exact moment the kid vanishes and gets replaced by a stranger. And according to Douglas, that final night, it was probably Michelle who stood firm. And that pushback was the spark that set off the violence that would destroy the whole family. When Michael Douglas got to the legal side, his tone changed totally and got almost cold and practical, which makes his words hit even harder because he made clear he wasn't asking for leniency or special understanding because of Nick's mental health history. It was the opposite. He insisted the prosecution should focus on premeditation, saying it wasn't a psychotic break where Nick couldn't tell right from wrong, but someone who knew exactly how to manipulate people and the legal system, just like he had manipulated his parents for years, pointing out that Nick turned himself in without fighting and hired lawyers right away. Something that, according to Douglas, doesn't fit someone out of touch with reality, but a coward who just wants to survive. A fiery stance coming from a close friend that basically tears apart the defense strategy before the trial even starts. In one moment of his statement, Michael Douglas widened the view and spoke directly to the whole industry, describing what he called the Hollywood curse, not as bad supernatural luck, but as a system failure in raising kids with boundaries in a world where there are basically no limits. He compared the Reiner home to a kingdom where the prince was allowed to burn down the village because the king couldn't bear to lock him in the tower. And he spoke to other parents in the business with words that seemed like a message to his younger self too, saying that by thinking you're giving them the world, you're actually taking away their survival instinct. And he painted a heartbreaking picture of Rob Reiner, a man who gave the world so many laughs and so much heart in movies like The Princess Bride, dying in a house completely empty of joy. An awful irony that sums up the tragedy in its cruelest form. Michael Douglas also talked about the silence around the family's other kids, Jake and Romy. And while he praised them, he made clear their story is deeply sad too, because, according to him, they lost their brother many years ago, and now they've lost their parents, trapped in the memory of that missing brother, revealing that for a long time there was a quiet split in the family, since the other kids had built walls to protect themselves from the constant chaos Nick brought, while Rob and Michelle stayed alone in the danger zone because they were the only ones who refused to leave, the only ones who still believed love and patience could fix everything, turning them into the last ones exposed when it all finally blew up. Michael Douglas admitted that more than once he advised Rob to sell the Brentwood house, move to a condo, get security, and force Nick to stand on his own. But Rob's answer was always the same, that his son needed a home to come back to. And over time, the beautiful house that showed his success turned into a trap. Because in Douglas's voice, you can clearly hear survivor guilt as he compares his own life to his friends, remembering that he managed to make peace with Cameron and see him get out of prison and become a normal person, while Rob only got tragedy. And he confessed that Rob asked him constant questions about the prison system, because he was terrified of Nick going to jail, thinking he was too fragile and sensitive to survive there. But Douglas always said prison might have saved his life, an idea Rob could never accept. Spending millions on private rehabs, wellness centers, gurus, and shrinks just to avoid the one thing that might have changed everything: accountability. The most shocking reveal came when Michael Douglas talked about the time before the trial and made clear he's ready to testify if called, saying he kept old voicemail messages from Rob that he never deleted. Messages where the fake front completely fell away, and that, according to him, could all change how the public sees the case. Because in those recordings, it's not a happy family hiding a sudden tragedy, but an emotional captivity that lasted over a decade. Douglas explained he saved them, thinking one day he could play them for Nick, to make him see what he did to his dad, never imagining they'd end up played for a jury. And with that, the story stops being a tragic murder and becomes a preventable death that points blame not just at the direct person responsible, but also at the doctors who prescribed meds without checks, the friends who looked the other way, and the system that lets powerful families hide domestic violence behind secret deals and private security. Michael Douglas made clear that with his words, he was calling out how Hollywood handles its troubled kids, saying the industry also protected the Reiner family's image, which ended up allowing the family itself to be destroyed. And he asked the listeners to hear the silences between his words. Because when the journalist asked how he wanted Rob remembered, Douglas didn't say as a great director, but as a man who loved too much. A line that sounded less like praise and more like a diagnosis. A warning to all the parents listening to watch what happens when you refuse to let your kids hit bottom. Remembering that bottom has a basement, and that basement was where Rob and Michelle ended up trapped. And though the reaction to his words has been shock, it's also brought a weird sense of relief, because for the first time, someone seemed to be telling the truth without a PR filter. Michael Douglas said that for years, the public story hid in easy explanations, showing Nick as a loving son fighting inner demons. But he was blunt in saying that version didn't match the reality he saw, describing him not as a victim of circumstances, but as a predator in his own home, while his parents became the prey. A harsh and brutal statement that still rang true for many, because it backed up that uncomfortable feeling when the first police photo came out. That no remorse expression that for Douglas wasn't new, because he said he'd seen that same face years ago at a Thanksgiving table, on a film set, and also seen Rob Reiner look away every time that truth became clear, letting fear and misunderstood love win the day. As the case heads into January, Michael Douglas made clear the story isn't just about Nick Reiner versus the state of California anymore, but about Rob Reiner's full legacy and whether his death will be a real wake-up call. Because Douglas has put himself as the guardian of the truth, the only one refusing to let the defense paint Nick as a victim of circumstances, saying his duty now is to defend his friend, making sure the world understands that Rob didn't just die, but was sacrificed on the altar of his own patience. And he remembered a detail that hangs in the air: Rob's laugh. That loud and contagious laugh he hadn't heard in at least 3 years. Because in their last meetings, Rob was there in body, but gone inside. Always checking his phone, always jumpy, already grieving the son he wished for, while living terrified of the son he had. And that's why Douglas insists the final act was just the end of a story written many years before, inviting everyone not to just follow the legal moves, but to ask themselves what he asks every night. What hope is left for anyone if even someone with his power and experience couldn't save his best friend? Ending that this isn't just celebrity gossip, but a real-time classic tragedy, a painful lesson that will haunt Hollywood for generations if they choose to look away again. Press that subscribe button, turn on notifications so you never miss a video, and share this with others.